Ciao a tutti stumani, sturani e benvenuti in questo nuovo video. Quest'oggi, anche se lo schermo è nero, è un altro video di reacteremo a cosa sarebbe successo se il telegramma di Zimmermann sarebbe andato bene. Per chi non lo sapesse, il telegramma di Zimmermann è stato un telegramma mandato dal secondo Reich al Messico per attaccare gli Stati Uniti e non farli entrare nella grande guerra, e è stato intercettato. È come l'altra volta di Rewriting History. Iscrivetevi a lui e anche a me, già che ci siete, mettete like a entrambi, bravi. Il video completo è in descrizione, senza io che parlo, però andremo a vedere com'è questo scenario e andremo a vedere la sua realisticità.
The Zimmermann telegram I see as possibly one of the most interesting what ifs in history. Of course, the German telegram to Mexico was beyond impossible to succeed in its goal, with Mexico in a civil
Vero?
war, having one of the weakest military industries in the world at the time. Their odds at holding off the Americans for a few months would be slim to none. Sure, the whole idea was to distract the Americans long enough for Germany to capitulate France, but this was a pipe dream for the German High Command. But what if this was successful? What if Mexico had joined the Central Powers, even though it would be a terrible idea for them? There are quite a few reasons why Mexico didn't join the Central Powers, and many more reasons as to why Germany wanted them to do so. Let's start with what exactly the Zimmermann telegram was and what it really
Ecco,
meant to
questo l'ho già
do.
spiegato
The
prima.
Zimmermann telegram was named after the dude right here. Wanna guess his name? Arthur Zimmermann. Creative.
Wow.
This was the German State Secretary for Foreign Affairs at the time, and was sent to Heinrich von Eckart, the German ambassador to Mexico. It was intercepted and decoded, then translated by the British intelligence, and then forwarded to the United States. On a quick side note, the only reason why this was successfully decoded was because of a failed German expedition to Afghanistan out of all places, where a man named Wilhelm Wasmus left his codebook, which the Entente later recovered. So, subscribe to the channel if you want to see a video on what if this guy right here didn't drop his notebook
Ecco, fatelo anche per me. Iscrivetevi al canale, bravi.
in 1916. The actual telegram included plenty of vital information, starting off with the fact that the German Empire was going to begin unrestricted submarine warfare on the 1st of February in an attempt to keep the United States neutral. Then it stated that, if this attempt is not successful, we propose an alliance on the following basis to Mexico. The next paragraph stated that Mexico and Germany would make war together and make together peace, as well as include that Germany would provide financial support and promise them.
Quindi, cioè, nel caso vincerebbe la Germania, il Messico sarebbe il suo alleato e quindi avrebbe territori, ad esempio New Mexico, Arizona,
The states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas.
non
The
più solo
following
Texas.
paragraph was mostly about how Heinrich von Eckart would present the message to the Mexican president, and at the very end of the telegram it is suggested that the Mexican president mediates between Germany and Japan. It ended off by saying that the employment of ruthless submarine warfare now promises to compel England to make peace in a few months. Believe it or not, this was not Germany's first attempt to start a war between Mexico and America. In 1914, the Ipiranga incident had aided in arming Mexico, and in 1915, German naval intelligence officer Franz von Reutlingen gave Victoria Huerta, a Mexican general and politician, $12 million for that purpose. Mexico was also holding German saboteurs like Walter Wiltske. These efforts were partially successful, as Woodrow Wilson ordered the military to invade Veracruz in 1914 in response to the Ipiranga incident. All-out war between Mexico and America was prevented by the Niagara Falls Peace Conference. This occupation was a major factor for Mexico remaining neutral in the First World War. So, now we know what the Zimmermann telegram actually said. Now, why did Germany want Mexico as an ally? Well, it's very simple: to distract America. American shipments to France and England were the thing that Germany thought were keeping them in the fight. Germany wanted Mexico to distract America long enough so American exports to France and England would slowly stop, allowing the German troops to capture Paris with a weaker allied line of defense.
Un'altra cosa è che l'America aiutava la Gran Bretagna e conseguenzialmente anche la Norvegia a tenere un blocco navale contro la Germania e l'Austria-Ungheria, così che non possono accedere al mare. Quindi senza i sottomarini americani, che erano tanti, quelli i tedeschi dovevano affrontare soltanto quelli britannici e avrebbero potuto rompere il blocco.
This is the right time when Germany was just about to succeed on the Eastern Front, capitulating Russia, so they were aiming to combine their armies and put all of their forces at France. Even historically, with America in the war, Germany managed to do some gains in the Ludendorff offensive, but this was not enough, and American involvement proved vital for Germany losing the Western Front. Also, another reason why Germany wanted the Mexicans on their side is because Mexico supplied 75% of the fuel for the British Royal Navy, which could have certainly tilted the naval war to Germany's favor, at least for a little bit. Germany was riding off on a wave of confidence after the collapse of the Eastern Front, and thought that this is all they would need to win the war. Now, why did Mexico refuse? Well, multiple reasons, which are very justified.
Allora, il Messico era appena uscito da una guerra civile nel 1908 e stava per ricominciare, cioè era molto vicina a ricominciare, il paese era molto instabile ed era anche poco avanzato, quindi non era nelle condizioni per entrare in una guerra con a quel tempo lo stato più forte del mondo e il più forte del mondo, penso, no, forse la Cina è più forte, boh, ancora oggi, quindi
First off, Mexico was in a civil war, and even the president's position was far from secure. He was later assassinated in 1920. A war with the United States of America would see many of the northern rebels gaining American support, leading to a less advantageous front line. Secondly, the United States was stronger than the entirety of Mexico combined. Even if we assume that a sort of Mexican United Front is formed, there is no real scenario where Mexico could win a war against the United States,
vero.
or even hold them off enough for Germany to make a difference in Europe. While Germany knew this and just wanted Mexico to be a distraction, Mexico would very obviously not support this. Third, in the Zimmermann telegram, Germany promised generous financial support, and this was very unreliable. For example, in 1916, Germany informed Carranza that it would not provide gold needed to stockpile in the independent Mexican bank. The fourth reason why Mexico didn't want to join this war is, even assuming that Mexico manages to win against America, the chances of it occupying and pacifying these territories it would get from America would be slim to none. As one wise Yamamoto put it, you cannot invade the mainland United States, there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. This would be very apparent for Mexico trying to occupy thousands of square miles of American land. The fifth reason is that Mexico didn't want to risk alienating other foreign nations, for example the ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil and Chile, that organized in the Niagara Falls Peace Conference. Declaring war on the United States of America would strain relations with these countries, which, if Mexico was going to invade the United States, would need to buy weapons from them. So, very obviously, there is no chance for Mexico to realistically accept this offer. Even if the Mexican president had sent back a list of demands to be met, they'd either be refused by Germany or negotiations would eventually break down. To make this scenario work, we need to improve Mexico's position from the start of the war, so they at least think that they would have a chance at success. But how to exactly do that? Well, I think that we could tweak their civil war and total socio-political economic situations in the nation leading up to World War I. You know, the basic stuff.
Introducing Grammarly, like you've never seen before. Your all-in-one writing essential.
Well, to have Mexico be more willing to accept this, we need to change the Mexican Revolution, which started on the 20th of November 1910, but it can be traced back to 1876, when Porfirio Diaz came to the presidency. He would remain in office until 1911, making use of sham elections to keep himself in power. In 1911, Francisco Madero led a coup against the government that actually worked, established elections which he won. He would later be ousted from power on the 19th of February 1913 by Victoriano Huerta. Why exactly this happened, you may ask? Well, it's because Madero had only really won this election because he was popular for ousting Porfirio Diaz, not because he had any positive political impact. His presidency was largely mismanaged, and he really got overthrown because he didn't know what he was doing. So I suggest that we change the 1911 election, so Francisco León de Olvera take power instead. Now I'm going to admit this is a little hard to happen, as these were the results of the 1911 election. 99.3%.
Aspetta. Allora, in uno stato molto instabile, in uno stato molto politicamente diviso, io non penso che 99,27% della popolazione vota un candidato solo. Cioè, questa cosa è stata molto, molto... C'era una possibilità su 1000 che succedeva. Poi scusa, 87 persone hanno votato questo tizio qua. E 20.000 hanno votato lui, Maduro. Cioè, questa cosa la vedo un po' irrealistica, anche se è successa. Cioè, mi chiedo com'è successa.
percent for Francisco Madero and only 0.4 for the candidate we want to win, Francisco León de Olvera. Turning this election around is very unrealistic, don't get me wrong, but Mexico joining the Central Powers.
Cos'era quel Kim Jong-un? Aspetta,
Turning this election around is
elezioni normali. Kim Jong-un.
very unrealistic, don't get me wrong, but Mexico joining the Central Powers in 1917 is even more unrealistic. So I'm going to take the path of least resistance with this one. I already stated how dire the situation was in Mexico, so don't even assume that this video is realistic or meant to be taken seriously the slightest, because it's not. So
È
with
vero, ragazzi, io e lui e anche altra gente ho tirato un pugno al computer con il dito indicando il tizio perché l'ho fatto. Non vogliamo essere politici, questi video non sono per fare politica, non sono per fare nessun tipo di propaganda. Riprendiamo il video adesso che possiamo e ci siamo salvati il culo dall'algoritmo.
that out of the way, the easiest way you can have Francisco León de Olvera to take power is to have Madero not want to run for presidency, instead possibly working with a different government job. Whoever opposes Francisco León de Olvera can just lose. Now we don't need to speculate on what a Francisco León de Olvera presidency would look like, as he was a placeholder ruler until the election from the 25th of May to the 6th of November 1911. He had been pressured to run the country by himself, but refused and established elections that put Madero in charge. Francisco León de Olvera is recognized as having a rather successful presidency, passing reforms to fund rural schools and promoted aspects of agrarian reform. He also implemented workmen's compensation and added an 8-hour workday. He did
Ah, mi sono ricordato adesso. Se non sapete l'inglese, beh, l'ho imparato, ci sono pure i sottotitoli. Se ci sono delle parole che non sapete, aprite il Google Traduttore, lo cercate.
have a few unpopular policies, however, the largest one being that he wanted to disarm the irregulars and militias that had revolted against Diaz. This led to revolts in Baja
Cioè, se qualcuno vuole disarmare le milizie contro di lui, non mi pare tanto una mossa stupida.
California, Oaxaca, and Chiapas, which were also pressed rather easily. So, with Francisco León de Olvera in charge, we could see short-term increases in revolts in the country, as he would attempt to disarm the militias, but over time Mexico would become more and more stable. I went into this video thinking that I would have to improve Mexico's position a bit to make it more fair, if we want them to join the Central Powers, but if stopping the civil war is as easy as that, then I guess we can stick with it. This, however, doesn't make up for the other issues that Mexico is facing. While Francisco León de Olvera's presidency would
Beh, dico, cioè, anche se cambia presidente, è uno stato molto povero, anche se il governo è riformista tantissimo al massimo, tantissima industrializzazione, in quanti anni sono? 8, non diventa ricco subito.
most likely lift Mexico up economically a bit, it's not going to be enough to radically change the state Mexico is in. However, Mexico is in a strong enough position to make an interesting scenario, so we're throwing them into the fray. There is only one issue. Without a Mexican civil war, anger towards America wouldn't begin to brew, as America wouldn't be intervening in Mexico in this alternate history. Of course, for the purpose of this scenario, Germany could just step in and brew more trouble between them to make up for it. The Ipiranga incident most likely would still happen, albeit with a different person receiving the money. And with a more competent Mexico, we could see a better defense, or maybe a Mexican victory if we are lucky. I would go over with the latter option, as this would help build national pride, and show that America isn't as strong as some Mexicans may think, and this of course is very much false. This incident would still eventually cool down with a different peace conference that wouldn't need to be organized in the ABC nations.
Introducing ClickUp Super Agents, the world's first AI agents that natively collect
On the 16th of January 1917, Germany would still send Mexico the Zimmermann telegram, stating that they want Mexico to join the
Che è che c'è scritto qua? For... Ah, Japan. Per il Giappone, la California, io non penso.
Central Powers in exchange for economic support and promising 3 American states to Mexico. Francisco León de Olvera is nearing the end of his presidential term and would not be re-elected due to what was stated in the Mexican constitution. I don't think that he would choose joining such a war so late into his presidency, but we need to have him do it anyways, believing the German promise to capitulate England in a few weeks. This way the Mexican president can think that he can win this front in a few months and make sure that his successor would win the presidency easily, pushing forward his agenda. Now this is a splendid idea, so what could possibly go wrong? In this alternate history, Mexico joins the war a few days after the telegram is sent. Unsurprisingly, America will declare war on Mexico and begin to mobilize. At this point, Francisco León de Olvera may return the weapons he took from the irregulars and ask them nicely to hold the front line, which if they are given some promises such as gun rights and land, they are most likely to do so. This gives the formal Mexican army time to mobilize.
Allora, io non penso che anche se serve qualcuno al fronte, non penso che comunque darebbe le armi a persone che solo 4 anni prima, o anche 2, si stavano ribellando contro la nazione e quelle persone potrebbero benissimo incominciare ad attaccare la nazione stessa.
I can see Belize to be seized by Mexico rather quickly, as troops from
Ma cazzo. Sì, il Belize è abbastanza fottuto, ma anche tipo la Giamaica potrebbe essere in una posizione in cui il Messico potrebbe prenderlo.
there would have been pulled out from all over the British Empire as to fight in Europe, leaving small colonies like this rather undefended. This would be the extent of the offensive Mexican victories for the entire war. Within a month, American troops would start to appear on the border, clashing with the Mexican irregulars. After a few battles, the American army would enter Coahuila and other North Mexican states. The Mexican army would slowly mobilize and eventually arrive at the front line, but hardly slow down the pace of the American advancements. America might invade Veracruz again in hopes to capture Mexico.
Aspetta.
The American advancements.
Ah, questa è Veracruz, ma non penso ci possa arrivare facilmente. Cioè, dalla Florida ci può arrivare, certo, però non so se gli farebbero arrivare, cioè, riuscirebbe a fare l'atterraggio, anche l'atterraggio. Non so se riuscirebbe a fare lo sbarco perché c'è stato un altro incidente marino poco tempo fa e quindi il Messico si dovrebbe... Sì, il Messico dovrebbe cercare di avere una armata navale più forte.
America might invade Veracruz again in hopes to capture Mexico City sooner, and if they decide to engage in this operation, I think that they would be successful. However, holding Veracruz would be like Germany holding on to Belgium, lots of guerrillas and lots of unrest. Speaking of Germany, how would they be doing with this new front opening up? Well, they would be right about American exports to France and Britain decreasing, but for the first few weeks or even months, nothing would visibly change, except for France not going on the offensive as much. Around the 4-month mark, Germany would manage to start up an offensive there, possibly capturing all of Belgium and getting quite close to Paris. Going back to Mexico, after the first 2 months of war, it would be apparent that Mexico wouldn't win this conflict. With the American army approaching Mexico City from the north and east, Francisco León de Olvera would either step down from the presidency or be assassinated. Mexico would back out 3 months after joining the conflict.
Ecco, se il presidente se ne va, molto probabilmente il prossimo presidente farebbe pace con gli Stati Uniti perché si trovano in una situazione pessima. Vediamo cosa dice. eh, Rewriting
and
history.
sign a peace treaty with America. The United States under Woodrow Wilson wouldn't be too keen to punish Mexico, especially because they didn't want to sour relations with them too much. However, President Wilson would want to secure a path to Mexico City and tend any conflicts fast if need be. Starting off, Mexico would have to return Belize to the United Kingdom. For now, it will be occupied by American forces until Britain has troops to spare. Baja California would be annexed into the United States of America, most likely being made into a territory, not part of California itself. Veracruz would be occupied by the Americans for 20 years, giving them control over the port city that is close to the Mexican capital. Lastly, the Mexican-American border would be expanded southwards a little bit. This territory would be folded into Texas, which would have electoral changes that I'm going to get into in a little bit. And with that, this is the peace treaty on Mexico, which would soon begin to collapse on itself, with Francisco.
Più che altro adesso le regioni messicane, tipo questa qua di cui non mi ricordo il nome, lo Yucatan, dato che qua c'è dell'occupazione americana da una città portuale, devono fare tutto via terra e non possono andare via mare più facilmente, quindi se si ribellano.
Leon de la Vera's successor possibly being assassinated or stepping down again. The irregulars of the Mexican army that were armed and promised land would occupy the northern half of the country, making it impossible to enforce law there. More revolts would take place in the south as well, with others seeing their chances to take power. Mexico would thus fall into a civil war. This time it would be the people against what would most likely be a military junta. But before we go into depth on this alternate Mexican civil war,
Con questo il Messico potrebbe anche fare come in Russia e diventare un paese comunista. E ovviamente questo all'America non piacerebbe e avendo occupato gran parte di Messico potrebbe esserci una, a questo punto, terza guerra americo-messicana.
what is Europe actually looking like? Well, Mexico was a good distraction for the Entente, allowing Germany to gain more land in northern France, but not enough to have the empires be captured. Upon the Mexican surrender, the German High Command would begin to panic, organizing the final offensive as to take Paris before the Americans arrive in Europe en masse. This offensive would likely still fail, and going into the winter of 1917, the Germans wouldn't be filled with morale. With extended German gains, the conflict could drag on for longer, with Germany possibly fighting until spring of 1919. However, an armistice would still have to be signed, and a similar peace treaty would be imposed on the Central Powers. The only
Sì, cambierebbe soltanto il fatto che la guerra finisce qualche mese dopo, quindi sì.
difference is that Germany may be punished a little bit more, with the Saarland either being expanded and Denmark gaining more territory, or Poland could annex more of East Prussia.
Più che altro penso che potrebbe succedere che la Bavaria diventi indipendente.
Either way, Germany is hurt more than historically. Now back to Mexico, the military would take charge of the country, and this would begin to worry America and Britain. While direct involvement until the end of the war would be limited, American troops would probably attempt to aid the junta, as the irregulars would be mad about having to fight and losing to America, while the junta might be seen as a possible government to reinstate democracy. However, with the Great War coming to an end, the American populace would see a surge in anti-war and
È vero, cioè, già gli americani hanno appena finito la prima guerra mondiale, hanno delle truppe che combattono in Russia e combattere anche in Messico non piacerebbe tanto alla popolazione.
pro-isolationist movements. American support to Mexico decreases to supplies and war materials. British aid would decrease as well, with them needing to send troops elsewhere.
Sì, che poi anche i britannici molto probabilmente non manderanno truppe e basta, perché sono già in Russia, già hanno fatto la prima guerra mondiale e poi c'è anche l'Irlanda, che vedete qua in questa immagine sfocata che è rossa e non è ancora indipendente. Ecco, siamo nel 19 e tra 3 anni si rivolta. Cioè, rivolta.
This Mexican revolution would be different from the one we had historically, as it would coincide with the Russian Revolution, so the irregulars might pick up the ideas of communism. If this is the case, we could see British and American support for the military junta to increase drastically as to combat communist influence in Latin America. This could by extension decrease the aid to the Russian White Army, which is an interesting consequence, making them lose even so slightly quicker. This could be a cool butterfly effect that Mexico joining the Central Powers, Russia suffers less casualties, but said casualties are suffered in Mexico in their civil war instead. Now if I had to put my money on a side here in this Mexican civil war, I would go with the irregulars. This is because historically they won during the Mexican Revolution and kept up a swag against the falling government that followed. Even with aid to the junta, I think that the irregulars could be able to succeed after the stock market crash of 1929, which would limit the support that foreign powers could give to the Mexican junta. I would have the irregulars take power in 1931, establishing a socialist/communist state. What is interesting is that Trotsky would have been exiled to Turkey at this point, and instead of going from Turkey to France, to Norway, to Mexico, he may just straight go to Mexico.
È vero, quando Trotsky è stato esiliato poi è andato in Messico, adesso andrebbe direttamente in Messico e potrebbe anche entrare nel governo messicano.
Where he would be given position in government. This would send waves of paranoia through the Soviet Union, especially with Stalin, but any assassination attempts against him would be harder than historically. Now we have a communist Mexico in the Western Hemisphere.
Ecco, gli Stati Uniti adesso non sono tanto felici e probabilmente la seconda guerra mondiale no, ma la guerra fredda sarebbe andata molto differentemente perché gli Stati Uniti già avevano Cuba addosso con le armi nucleari russe. A questo punto anche il Messico e sarebbero sotto molta più pressione.
Something that America doesn't really like. But what would this communist Mexico actually do? Well, during the Great Depression, communism would become more popular in Central America, and while no nation exactly
Allora, in Nicaragua e anche un po' l'Honduras ci si sono avvicinati, quindi probabilmente incominceranno a diventare, però non sono diventati completamente comunisti, quindi a un certo punto l'Honduras non, non sicuramente, ma sicuramente il Nicaragua a un certo punto diventerebbe uno stato comunista.
became communist, it took a lot to keep these parties from ever coming to power. For example, El Salvador had a communist insurgency in 1932, which failed. With Trotsky in government, we could possibly see Mexican aid to the insurgency and a possible success. With succeeding communist nations in Mexico and El Salvador, more parties would become popular in the region. A few other nations that could fall to communism as a result of that would include Honduras in their 1932 election, Nicaragua before Anastasio Somoza takes control of the National Guard in 1933, and in Costa Rica, but they would be elected into power like Honduras. Now, looking at this map, you may ask why not Guatemala and Panama? Well, Guatemala had now arrested
Allora, Panama non può, cioè ci sono gli americani qui che non vogliono. E il Guatemala
all the leaders of their communist party, and Panama was just too weak. What is interesting is that the Great Depression barely affected the Soviet Union, as they had their own market and weren't trading with the Americans, so initially communism may give a surge to the economy of set nations in Central America. Basically, in this alternate history, Mexico and Central America are now red, so what? Well, the chances of it going any further than this would be slim to none, as America would literally be breathing down Mexico's back. As the mid-1930s would come around, all eyes would be taken off Mexico and placed on Germany and Japan. This would give Mexico some more wiggle room and would allow them to build up their military and economy some more. Even though Mexico and Central America are socialist or communist, they're not going to ally with the Soviet Union most likely, but who knows. These two regions are quite far geographically, and Trotsky could be causing problems as well. Stalin would like to assassinate him, and this would bring Mexico to the rest of the Soviet sphere, but I cannot say if this would happen or not. As Japan and Germany would begin their expansion, Mexico might see this as the right time to invade Guatemala and install a communist regime in the country, as it would better allow them to communicate with their allies down south. America would send Mexico a very harshly worded letter, but do nothing after that, like how they did with Germany leading up to the Second World War, twice. Talk about appeasement. On a side note, one major change that would
un'altra cosa, non so se ne sta per parlare, però senza il Messico che lo fa, beh, potrebbe comunque farlo, nessuno condannerebbe l'Anschluss alla Società delle Nazioni e quindi probabilmente la Germania potrebbe invadere la Polonia senza effetti e la seconda guerra mondiale incomincerebbe con l'invasione della Danimarca.
happen in this alternate history would change the trajectory of the entire world. Historically, in March 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, nobody really
Lo
cared, but
sapevo.
Mexico was the only country to diplomatically protest this. Now, with Mexico being altered so much, they are unlikely to care and protest this diplomatically. So in this alternate history, literally nobody would care about Austria being eaten, not even Mexico. In 1939, the Second World War would break out, and Mexico doesn't really do anything. They would sit around and improve their economic state, as well as their military. However, by the end of 1940, with Britain being the only nation that would be fighting Germany, Mexico might demand Belize or at least they get independence. America could protest this, but still they would not be willing to intervene. Britain might decide to just leave the territory, not wanting to fight another front. They would be already fighting Germany. As for Britain, starting another war could risk the collapse of the entire government. And so Mexico expands ever so slightly, either directly annexing Belize or simply establishing a socialist puppet government there. If Britain concedes like this to Mexico, then this could pave the way for Argentina to demand the Falklands and South Georgia Islands, which could create a butterfly effect of land demands from the British, hence why Britain could not be willing to accept the Mexican demands in the first place. But you know what, times would be dire for them in 1940 and may accept giving up Belize, also known as British Honduras back then, just so Britain can focus on Germany and rally their people to resist and keep fighting. For the duration of the war, Mexico wouldn't get involved. This is because they know that they wouldn't stand a chance if they cooperated with Germany once again, and they would be ideologically different from the Soviet Union, so it would be much harder for Mexico to do anything else. They would however join the war on the side of the Allies in the closing weeks of the war, as to be able to join the United Nations, like many nations did historically. They wouldn't send any troops or equipment, but they would formally declare war on Germany. Mexico actually had some important roles in the Second World War in our history, which would be lacking in this alternate history. For example, many Mexican pilots flew in the Pacific Theater, and Mexico was also important in
Molto probabilmente tutti questi ruoli verranno dati al Brasile, che anche lui ha avuto un grande effetto sulla seconda guerra mondiale di cui non si parla, e il Brasile diventerebbe uno stato dopo la guerra, no, e dopo la guerra il Brasile verrebbe ricompensato di più e diventerebbe più forte.
shutting down more German trade. With Mexico off the war, we could see some very minor differences as a result of that, but it wouldn't affect the war too much in the bigger picture, at most by a day or two. The real interesting part would be the Cold War. Now, with the conflict ending, the United States
Più che altro durante il non so come si dice in italiano, è Sino-Soviet Split, com'era? La divisione sino-sovietica, non lo so. Durante quello il Messico sarebbe uno dei pochi paesi che si metterebbe dalla parte della Cina.
States of America and the Soviet Union would emerge as the two world superpowers, using the world as their game board. But what would Mexico's role be here? Well, with Mexico being communist, the Red Scares would be much more real, with possibly even some American politicians pushing for an invasion of Mexico before it's too late. The CIA would also be fiddling with Central American countries, which they tend to do. At the same time, Mexico would try to make it apparent that they aren't anything remotely close to the Soviets, possibly attempting to do something like Yugoslavia did and start their own neutral movement. This likely wouldn't stop the CIA from overthrowing other Central American countries, but this would have to be in the form of violent coups that would cause more harm than good down the line. Think of Pinochet's Chile. As Cuba becomes communist, Mexico would attempt to distance themselves from them, siding with the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Non penso.
Mexico would slowly become more accepting of the West and become more of a socialist nation rather than communist. Eventually, America would return Veracruz, which they would have held for a little bit longer than promised due to the Mexican government. This would please Mexico. They would open up to the Western markets. Products like cars, televisions, and comic books would begin to take its toll on Mexico, shaping their culture to be more Western, perhaps sooner than historically, due to this increased collaboration. By the time that communism inevitably collapses in the Soviet Union and their sphere, Mexico would have turned from a communist state to something more socialist closer to Vietnam, rather than China or the Soviets.
Più che altro potrebbe succedere questa cosa. Durante sempre il Sino-Soviet Split, la Cina potrebbe costruirsi una sua sfera di influenza, includendo la Cambogia, il Messico, l'America centrale e la Jugoslavia. E quindi potrebbe anche succedere un effetto domino dove c'è una guerra fredda a tre partiti e ci sarebbe un casino.
While they are smaller, they might be doing a little bit better economically than historically. By now, Baja California would have been given statehood and would become a blue state. Texas, with expanding into more of northern Mexico, might have a harder time becoming a concrete red state, that it is stereotypically. Texas may become more of a swing state like Pennsylvania and Florida in the 2000s. I'm sure that this thing would not complicate any American elections, as surely neither of these were very close and could change the world forever. Jokes aside, Al Gore becoming the United States president in this alternate timeline I see as the most likely, which is a crazy butterfly effect from Mexico joining the Central Powers, but hey, here we are. Make sure to check out this video about what if Napoleon III managed to puppet Mexico in 1860. I hope you have a great day and goodbye.
Great day e goodbye anche a me, perché questo video, se vi è piaciuto, iscrivetevi a lui e anche a me, mettete like a lui e anche a me, Vabbè, ragazzi, spero che il video vi sia piaciuto, è tipo un approfondimento, oppure un portiamo youtuber americani o inglesi o bulgari, perché lui è bulgaro, in Italia. Speriamo di sì, perché gli italiani conoscono solo youtuber italiani. E quindi ragazzi, spero che il video vi sia piaciuto, ricordatevi di iscrivervi, mettere like, mettere hype. Iscrivetevi a Rewriting History come vi dovete iscrivere a me. E possiamo dire che Stagno vi saluta e ci vediamo al prossimo video. Ciao!